But it was a close call, and it's worth reflecting for a minute on what happened in the last year. One thing that happened is, I think, President Obama made some mistakes. I don't know that it couldn't have happened. It'd be a big mistake, incidentally, to assume that it was inevitable that Obama and Pelosi et al. Would fail. I mean, I'm sort of assuming that they've failed, at least for now, which I think by their own lights they probably have, and by most Americans' lights they have. They did not persuade the country that theirs was the direction that one had to go, or that one should go, in a big way. And in that respect, as I say, we've dodged the bullet. One thing that helped was that they made all kinds of tactical errors. If they hadn't made those errors, I don't know what would have happened. You know, I can write a scenario where Obama has a very good first year without changing much of the fundamentals of his legislative agenda, but just being smarter about how to sell it and what parts of it to do first, and how to fracture the Republicans on the stimulus instead of letting them unite, et cetera, et cetera. It's not worth getting into the details looking back. He didn't need to fail, but I think he has, so he deserves some of the credit. Someone commented that President Obama was the first community organizer to become president, and he turned out to be a very good community organizer. He organized a community of about 60% of the American public who were horrified by his legislative agenda. And then they got themselves together and seemed to have done a pretty good job of blocking it. So President Obama deserves some credit. I think you should never be careful for what you wish for in life and in politics. He had a huge financial crisis that helped propel him into the White House. He wasn't really ahead by much, if anything, on September 15th when Lehman Brothers collapsed. He had huge majorities in Congress. He got 60 votes in the Senate through very narrow and weird margins and weird adventitious events. Senator Stevens being investigated by the Bush Justice Department, an investigation that was thrown out by the judge ultimately, but enough to defeat him in Alaska. Franken wins by 350 votes in Minnesota. Specter switches parties. So a lot of little events give him 60 seats in the Senate. So there he is, huge crisis, large majorities in Congress, and it turns out that could have been the worst two things that happened to him. The large majorities meant that they were in charge of everything. It meant that they were very tempted, therefore, to push things through without laying the groundwork for it in public opinion. And it turns out that here in America, the public does rule, I think, even with large majorities, and it's hard to push things through in a partisan way when there's really big public resistance. The crisis led to Rahm Emanuel, the White House Chief of Staff, famously saying right after the election, you should never let a good crisis go to waste, which I think might go down as one of the stupidest and most self-destructive things said by anyone in the Obama administration. Because it's that kind of, dime store Machiavellianism that sounds very clever, and we're going to use this crisis to get this whole agenda we've been dreaming about for 30 years through. But it turns out the public isn't foolish, and the public wants, if there's a crisis, it would like the crisis addressed. It might then be open, incidentally, if the crisis were successfully addressed, to other changes being advanced by the president and by the congressional majority. But they would like the crisis addressed first. Roosevelt did that. We can now, 50 years later, we can say, well, some of that stuff didn't work so well, but it seemed to be working at the time. The country, the first thing was, there was a bank holiday, not health care reform, and not Social Security, incidentally. And by the time he got to much of the New Deal agenda, the lasting New Deal agenda, he at least seemed to have dealt with the immediate crisis. Obama chose the other path, I think emboldened by Rahm Emanuel's sort of cleverness in thinking this was the moment to jam things through, emboldened by Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid as the leaders, and I think it turned out to be a terrible miscalculation, one I'm happy about personally, but one that I'm sure historians will argue about how important it was for quite a while. Anyway, we owe Obama a debt of gratitude in that. I think Republicans, I would say, Republicans, for all the criticism one has of them and of the Republican congressional majorities between 1994 and 2006, the Republicans in Congress actually were pretty shrewd and pretty sensible, I would say, given how much they were reeling from their losses, given how shocking it was to lose everything in first 06 and then 08. I'd say the Republicans in Congress performed better than I expected in terms of pulling together in opposition to what they should have opposed, but not going off the deep end either, supporting the president where they thought he had done the right thing, the surge in Afghanistan, for example, and generally presenting to the American public a reasonable and loyal opposition party. I think if you had told me a year ago that the Republicans would do as well as they've done, I would have been surprised. And I think parties can really reel and do foolish things and fly off the handle in all kinds of ways when they suffer the kinds of defeat the Republicans did over the last couple of election cycles, and they didn't. So they deserve some credit. The conservative policy types and professors and writers deserve some credit for mounting a pretty stiff critique of Obama's economic and domestic policy proposals in particular, again, at a time where conservatives were so much on the defensive because some of their policies seem to have been called into question. Nonetheless, on health care, on financial regulation, the stimulus, economic policy in a lot of areas, it turned out the conservative intellectual movement was still pretty strong, and not just still strong, but actually turned out to find new people, new recruits, people who weren't well known before. The journals popped up that hadn't existed before. It was actually a sign of there was a lot of intellectual vitality on the right, much more than one might have expected given the circumstances. Having said all that, I think Obama would not have been stopped to the degree he's been stopped without two more factors. One, activists, conservative and independent activists, who really rose up, I think, sort of spontaneously and organized themselves to resist Obama's agenda. And they're now called the Tea Parties, in kind of shorthand. Obviously, a lot of them, that's sort of a term that covers a lot of people and a lot of activities. But I would say for all that conservative elites might have, little qualms and doubts about some of the, there are always these fringe characters who show up, and maybe these people haven't thought everything through as carefully as one would like in the, in the faculty lounges of certain law schools and economics departments. Still, we owe them a great debt. No one here should kid himself on that. No Tea Parties, no stopping of Obamacare. I absolutely believe that. We could have published all of our intelligent articles in the Weekly Standard, and the Journal could have done its editorials, and the Chamber of Commerce could have done its ads on TV without the spontaneous uprising, if that's the right word, of concerned citizens all over the country saying, wait a second, this is not what we signed on up for, and this has not been properly thought through, and you're trying to jam this down our throats without having a real debate. I don't think Obama's momentum would have been broken. I give the activists a lot of credit, and I always try to say this to them personally, and again, I don't know that they should run the whole country 3 years from now, and not all their ideas will work out quite as they hope, and they did a lot of this without much encouragement, as I say, from elite conservative organizations, or certainly not from the Republican Party. The Republican Party owes the Tea Partiers more than the Tea Partiers owe the Republican Party, and Republicans who sometimes speak condescendingly about the Tea Partiers and try to sort of pat them on the head and tell them to get in line should remember that, as I say, the debt is more the other way. I think ultimately they end up being part of a broader, reinvigorated conservative movement. Not without some tensions and not without some fighting, but that's fine, actually. Every healthy, growing movement has some tensions and some arguments and a little bit of chaos at least on the fringes of it. And finally, the American public deserve a lot of credit. The American public really could have been, it was a huge financial crisis. And people lost a quarter and a third of their lifetime investments. And it seemed to be because of Republican and conservative policies. I mean, we could have fancy arguments about how it was the Democrats in Congress who protected Freddie and Fannie more than the Republicans. But the fact is there was a Republican president from 2000 to 2008. And there's a Republican Congress basically from 1994 to 2006. And that is when the whole bubble built up. And if people were concerned about it, if the Bush administration was terribly concerned about the housing bubble, they didn't seem to be saying very much about it. And if Republicans in Congress were so concerned about all these things that they later on decided were terrible, they weren't very effective in doing anything about it. And it would have been perfectly reasonable for the American public, who are not paying close attention to these things, to blame Republicans and conservatives, and not just for 1 or 2 elections in 06 and 08, but for the next 5, 10, 20 years. I would just say you guys have just so thoroughly lost credibility that we can't put you in charge of anything, even if we're not confident Obama is doing the right thing. That's in a way what happened in 1930 and 32. It didn't happen this time. The public turned out to have internalized, I would say, certain more or less conservative views of the world, a little more than one might have expected. Skepticism about big government, skepticism about central planning, skepticism about that the problem with the U.S. and the world is that we're not nice enough to everyone, these sorts of things. The public really deserves a lot of credit, I think, for what's happened in the last year and for kind of keeping its head in the midst of a crisis and in the midst of the enthusiasm that President Obama was able to generate, which is, to his credit. And the public took out its anger on Republicans in 2006 and 2008, but that didn't mean that they were simply willing to be led along down any path by the Obama administration in 2009.